The views and opinions expressed in this podcast by the hosts and guests may or may not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of Miami University. This is Reframe, the podcast from the College of Education, Health and Society on the campus of Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. On our last episode, we spoke with Adam Beissel, a Miami University assistant professor of sport leadership and management, about all the ways data and analytics are not only changing the sport industry, but how it's also transforming business and even culture more broadly. That episode is available now. It's called How the Sport Analytics Revolution is Changing Society. But there was so much more to talk about, and we had such an interesting conversation that we wanted to give you the chance to hear the rest of it. So on this special bonus episode with Adam Beissel, we look ahead to the future of sport and how various economic, social, cultural, and technological forces, and even global politics, will continue to shape the industry, as well as what it may mean for the kinds of sports that dominate here in the U.S. in the years and decades ahead.
The biggest change for the sport industry over the next decade or two will be the convergence of technology and economics within the sport industry. In particular, what we're looking at is new modes of media consumption and streaming, right? So the demise of the traditional cable package. I think some people are perhaps overstating that. I think 75% of most television watchers still have a traditional cable package. But to understand how that's going to influence sport, you have to kind of understand how traditional cable works. Most sport leagues generate the preponderance of their annual revenue from broadcast revenue agreements, right? They're set long in advance. They pay networks like NBC, ABC. They pay billions of dollars for the rights to broadcast sporting leagues like the NFL. Those networks generate the revenue to support those investments from advertisements. And also, in some cases, some minor subscription fees. So we're talking about $1, $1 or $2 from your cable bill goes to pay off those sports rights fees. In the case of ESPN, it's about $3 to $4 every month. Whether you watch ESPN or not, when you pay your cable bill, you're subsidizing sport, right? But as technology changes and those traditional cable and satellite television packages reduce, you're now seeing streaming become much more prominent. And we're at this tipping point where it'll probably happen in the next 5 to 10 years, but there will be a sport league that goes fully streaming. And what's interesting for me to think through, and I speak with my students about a lot, is how might a sport change, or the way that we consume sport in an actual stadium change, if the rights are now on a streaming service where you don't have to have built-in ad breaks. So what happens if Amazon 20 years from now has the broadcast rights to the NFL? You don't necessarily have to have an ad break every 8 to 10 minutes and fill a 3.5-hour broadcast with an hour of advertisements, because the subscribers are paying through their monthly subscription fee $12 or $13 to subsidize that investment. So it could be that an NFL game gets reduced to 2 hours because you don't have to have those built-in ad breaks. Now, maybe I'm a bit optimistic. Would the NFL want to forego additional revenue when now you can collect subscription fees and the built-in commercials? But I do think there is value in reducing the overall start-to-finish time in an NFL game, and that might change how the game is contested, right? Coaches coach, for lack of a better term, around advertising breaks, right? So they know that in basketball, for instance, there are set commercial breaks at the under 16, under 12, under 8, under 4 minutes in college basketball. Coaches will substitute players out and substitute players in based on the expectation of television timeouts, TV timeouts. But if you don't need those built-in TV timeouts anymore, because the economic model is such that the revenue collected by those leagues come from subscriptions rather than advertisements for dish soap or car insurance, what does that mean in terms of what we're seeing in the arena, in the stadium? Maybe it changes how we experience sport in the flesh.
And maybe even how certain athletes are trained or prepared for certain positions, right?
Yeah, and athletes are specialized into particular positions. In the NFL, for instance, you've got the third down pass rush specialist whose job is maybe to play 8 to 12 plays per game and sack the quarterback on third down. if we're shortening the length of time in between series, maybe it changes the type of athletes that are valued. Maybe that pass rush specialist goes away, or maybe there are new specialists that emerge. Maybe I'm being idealistic, maybe I'm being optimistic about these things, but I do think that as the media technology landscape changes within contemporary sport, not just in the US, but all around the world, it's going to change how we, as fans sitting in a stadium, might experience live sport.
I don't think you're being idealistic or optimistic. I mean, maybe with some of the specific changes you would like to see, but it's amazing to think about how interconnected it all is. I mean, sports became this thing that just were fun to play. Then people started watching, which changed how they were played. Then broadcast media showed up, which further changed things. And now that is even intersecting with new technology and media and streaming services, which is changing things even more. So it's amazing to me to think about how interconnected it all is, but also how it seems like it's almost at the mercy of these inevitable changes, maybe.
Yeah, so we can turn to the college football landscape right now as a great understanding of how powerful particular networks and media companies are at really transforming sport. So setting aside some of the NIL, name, image, likeness changes that we're experiencing, you've recently seen Texas and Oklahoma declare that they are going to, or they plan to leave the Big 12 football conference or athletic conference in favor of a move to the SEC. The SEC is largely funded by ESPN and the Walt Disney Company, who sees bringing in teams like Texas and Oklahoma as a kind of financial no-brainer. And what had driven over the past decade or so conference realignment within the NCAA was the growth and investment from sport media companies like ESPN and CBS. And we're about to see another phase of that as streaming rights and the revenue from streaming rights. So the Disney Plus app and ESPN Plus streaming services collecting $12 to $15 from 100 million subscribers every month. There's so much money around that they can sort of say, well, hold on a second. We're going to use that money to find the best college football programs out there to create content that's going to generate subscriptions, generate eyeballs, and therefore revenue. Mm-hmm. And so the influence of media companies are really changing in college sports the alignments of historically grounded conferences, which have in some cases been around for 100 years.
Yeah. How does your research fit into what we've been talking about? What are some of the things you look at and study to help you understand how all these global pieces fit together?
Yeah, so my main research is on global sport mega events and the geopolitics of global and international sport. And so what I'm really looking at is the intersection between sport, economics, and global geopolitics. And one of the best ways to look at that is through international sport mega events. And so that's kind of a catch-all term for events that we tend to watch on a quadrennial basis. So we're talking about the Olympic and Paralympic Games, the men's and women's FIFA World Cups, and in some cases the Commonwealth Games or the men's and women's Rugby World Cups, and a couple other international events that generate large amounts of corporate sponsorship, large amounts of viewership, and attention over small periods of time. So a lot of my research focuses on, first and foremost, how do those events come to be in terms of getting through bid document analysis, who's going to pay for them, what are the promises, but then also looking at things post hoc, right? Or ex post, as we say. And did those promises live up to their billing, or to what extent did the cost of hosting those events come in over or under based on those promises? And so really what I'm looking at is the economic, social, and kind of political implications of hosting global sport mega events.
And you have a pretty big project coming up around the next, the World Cup. What's that involve?
Yeah, so in 2026, the United States, along with its North American neighbors, Mexico and Canada, will co-host the FIFA Men's World Cup. So by sport mega event standards, the FIFA Men's World Cup is what many consider to be the second largest global sport mega event behind the Olympic Games. The basis of kind of my research, or what I've done thus far, is really looking at the formation of that bid, the joint hosting format, and really the politics that went into that partnership when it was announced in the summer of 2018. So certainly the summer of 2018, we had former President Trump in office, and the politics and the relationships between our North American neighbors at that time were not all that strong, right? Particularly Trump running on a platform of build that wall, right? Saying derogatory things about our Mexican neighbors, revoking trade agreements with Canada. And so the announcement of this international soccer tournament that was billed under the banner of United as One, which was their branding campaign, raised many concerns, right? And questions around how can you have this international sport mega event billed as a celebration of unity and global partnership at a moment where politically these countries have had their lowest kind of arrangements in decades. And so a lot of my research sort of focused on that context, both what did the bid promise, what are the economic promises, how was it branded and sold to FIFA and the global community, and what were the kind of geopolitics that underpin the bid such that it eventually secured hosting rights for the 2026 Men's World Cup.
Right. I mean, that makes me think of like the messages we've heard surrounding sport forever. They're always under this banner of it brings us all together. There's this unifying force, and Olympics are, the world community promoting peace and understanding and all that. Does that actually seem, when you put it through that lens, is it disconnected from what's actually happening in the political reality? Does it make it seem like it's just lip service to an idea that's not really true? Or do you think that sport is losing its power to actually unite people?
And I think that's a great question. Certainly that discourse about sport being unifying exists, right? This idea that there aren't politics in sport. Well, most scholars, most of us would agree, well, that's flatly false, right? That sport can be a unifying thing, right? When the Milwaukee Bucks win the NBA championship and 100,000 people show up outside the arena to sort of celebrate, that does create some sort of shared sense of identity for the people in Milwaukee. But by the same token, sport can also be exclusionary. It can be exploitative. It can highlight the worst aspects of society. So you've got both things going on, and sport mega events are kind of the pinnacle of that dual sense, right? So if we look at the Tokyo 2020 games as a great illustration, this was a games that the Japanese government did not want to host. They said, please do not come here. But the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, that has the authority of those games, said, hold on a second, we are having these games whether you support it or not. And so that simple fact there, right, between the kind of politics of who controls global sport and how can a non-government organization, a sport organization, have the say to kind of impose itself on a community that didn't want the games, a community that supported the games for $5 billion of costs that now are going to cost $25 billion in total costs, of which the IOC is not going to pick up any of that. So how do we reconcile that? How do we kind of live with that contested nature of staging these sport mega events? I think is what scholars in my area are really trying to unpack. And don't get me wrong, I enjoyed the Olympic Games. I watched some of the events, but what I'm trying to get my students to think about certainly is to think critically about not only what they're watching, but how that stuff is produced and who is benefiting from it and who is being disadvantaged, marginalized, excluded, or bearing the sizable economic costs of hosting that sport mega event.
When you do work with students, what are some of the other things you try to reframe their thinking around or try to get them to see sport in a different way, especially when you pull the camera back and think about it in this larger, global sense?
Yeah, so, we tend to live our lives, particularly our students, in a very American-centric point of view. So when we think about sport, we're thinking about football, basketball, baseball. The Super Bowl tends to be the pinnacle of American sports viewership. If we put it in viewership numbers, we look at 100 million viewers, which is no small feat, right? 100 million viewers in this day and age of anything is significant. That also means that's only about 35% of the U.S. public. So there are a lot more people not watching the Super Bowl than actually are watching the Super Bowl. But if you put that in the scale of global sport, it's actually pretty insignificant. So your typical Barcelona-Real Madrid regular season matchup in Spain is going to generate twice as many, if not 5 times as many eyeballs or viewers as the American Super Bowl. You look at the Indian Premier League, so that's a cricket league in India, and the viewership numbers in a country with 1 billion people are even more significant than NFL viewership in North America. And so when you put American sport, while it seems really significant and impactful to us, when you put it in kind of that global context, there are sports and sporting events and leagues around the world that I try and get my students to think about. And as we become much more globally connected through technology and changes in kind of media, it's possible that they, as students working in the sport industry, might end up working in those leagues, working alongside those leagues, or working against those leagues in some cases, right? So if you're working for the NFL, trying to grow the NFL in London, you have to have a good understanding of the cultural, social, and economic significance of the Premier League in London, right? And so what I'm trying to get my students to think of is not only sport in America in a kind of contextual sort of way, but then putting North American sport and the North American sport industry in that global context.
Do you think that might be happening a bit naturally too? I mean, I think I have, maybe not with everybody, but especially amongst younger people, I think I have heard you say that you often overhear students talking like in the hallway about like the European Soccer League, which is not a conversation that used to happen, right? Like today I know a lot of soccer fans that are my age and younger, and that was never a thing when I was growing up, but people amongst the older generation still continue to talk about more traditional American things like the NFL draft and such. So, I mean, is there maybe just a natural organic shift towards this growing cultural awareness of sport from a global perspective, or at least more so than in the past?
Yeah, and I think the thing that I try and articulate to my students is that sport is what we call a contested terrain, right? This idea that sport leagues are vying for supremacy in terms of viewership, eyeballs, commercial dollars, and what was a dominant sport 100 years ago, boxing, horse racing, maybe American baseball, is not today. And although it's hard for us to imagine that the NFL won't be this dominant behemoth in perpetuity, it's probably not going to be. And so things change over time, and it's not only what we consume, but how we consume and which particular sport leagues adopt to changes in media technology quicker are likely going to be the leagues that dominate 20 to 30 years from now. And so to kind of bring it full circle, I think what I'm trying to get my students to think about is that notion of the contested terrain. It's easy for our students to identify how a North American sport league like the NBA is pursuing global markets, right? They're trying to expand it to China, into India, into Africa to grow the NBA's product. Similar with the NFL, similar to Major League Baseball. But what our students don't often think of is that there are international sport leagues looking at the American sport market in a similar way. For example, the English Premier League sees the potentially lucrative North American sport market as its goal. In fact, there are more English Premier League fans in America than there are in England. Why? Well, because of population differences, right? There's 6 times as many people in the United States as there are in England. And so the globalizing impetuses of North American sporting league conglomerates are matched by the same ones from other sport leagues around the world and other sport competitions. Rugby, for instance, sees America as this sort of blank canvas where they can try and sell the New Zealand All Blacks or the Rugby World Cup and try and grow rugby in this country. And so a lot of our students don't think about those external sport forms and sport leagues viewing America as this seemingly blank canvas for global growth. They only understand North American sport leagues looking at other countries as a potential for market expansion.
Is that hard, do you think, for some people to wrap their head around? I mean, in America, we're always used to being the exporter of culture. We've talked a lot about movies and music and popular culture, and a lot of that gets, emanates out from the U.S. But to think about it the other way around can be a pretty big mind shift. I mean, is that sometimes difficult to grasp?
I think so. I think once you put it in those terms, right, that this idea that global sport, it's a dialectic, right, that there's this two-way relationship between global sport leagues and international markets, and it's that contested terrain. And we don't know 50 years from now what is going to be the kind of dominant sport form, the ones that American families gather around the TV and watch. Heck, maybe we won't even do that in 50 years, right? It'll be individuals gather around their phone by themselves and like text their friends or their family members across the living room while they're watching their unique programs. But there's a very real possibility that's not going to be the NFL. It might be the NBA. It might be some sport that we haven't even seen yet, right? Particularly the growth of action sports among young people. So here we're talking about skateboarding and speed rock climbing, which was just in the Olympic Games, and surfing. They will certainly grow. The question is, will the bubble burst, right? Is there simply going to be too much content in sport or otherwise for people to consume? And I think sport can learn a little bit from some of the other industries, particularly television and the age of big TV, as they call it, right? Where there's just so much content out there that it's really hard to generate sustainable viewership or interest because there's just so much content being produced. There's simply not enough hours in the day. And so the thing that sport leagues are going to confront is a narrowing of sport interest based on media changes and the consumer preferences of different markets.
It certainly seems like we're in the middle of a lot of change. Do you feel like it's an exciting time or a very uncertain time as far as what lies ahead? I mean, I feel like maybe if you're a traditionalist, and you want things to stay the same, it might be kind of, apprehensive time. But, if you're excited about evolution and change and, new things on the horizon, it might be a pretty exciting time.
Yeah, so I would say keep an open mind. Things will be changing as they always have, right? In the 1950s, we listened to Vin Scully call games from the Brooklyn Dodgers on the radio. And 20 years after that, the Dodgers were in Los Angeles and you were watching on television. And it seems like things are kind of uncertain right now, but I can assure you that change has always been part of the sport industry, at least historically, and it will continue to do so. It's just the speed and rate of that change, I think, will be accelerated over the next decade or two.
Adam Beissel is an assistant professor of sport leadership and management at Miami University, where he teaches courses on sport economics and global sport perspectives. And this is the Reframe podcast. Thank you for listening to this bonus episode, and many more regular episodes are always available. You can find them wherever you listen to your podcasts.